Good morning and welcome to the 35th meeting in 2025 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. We have one public item on our agenda today, which is an evidence session with the Institute for Fiscal Studies in relation to the UK context of forthcoming Scottish Budget 2026-27. I'd like to welcome to the meeting David Phillips, Associate Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And I understand you've no opening statement to make, is that right, David? OK, we'll just go straight to questions. We don't have a submission either, so we'll just be asking a whole series of different kind of questions on the kind of budget. I think the first thing to ask about is the £820 million of additional funding that the Scottish Government is to receive. That's £510 million in resource and £310 million in capital funding over 5 years. And one of the issues with regard to that is it's very much front-loaded. So I just wonder if you can perhaps talk us through that as it ultimately leads to a cut in day-to-day spending in 28-29, I understand.
So I think, yes, overall, I think there's 2 points I'd make about this funding. Firstly, it's pretty small beer in the context of the Scottish Government's budget. You know, £510 million over 3 years of resource spending is sort of, less than 1/3% on the resource budget. It's also in the context of inflation forecasts that have been increased as well. So actually, in real terms, that increase doesn't make up for that higher inflation. So in real terms, the budget is sort of lower, even kind of for the fact you've sort of brought the money forward. And third, you're right there, not just for the Scottish budget, but more generally, one of the things the Chancellor did, and that's in the context of a spending review that was already quite front-loaded. She brought forward further funding into the next couple of years, and then reduced budgets, not just in 28-29, but actually 29-30 and 30-31 compared to what was previously planned. So obviously that means there's a bit more of a boost in the short term, although that's not really even keeping up with inflation. But in the longer term, that does make the sort of fiscal challenges a bit harder. So in the English context, these are supposedly can be delivered by efficiency savings on top of those already planned in England. And I guess the question for Scotland and Wales is, in the context of their budgets, do they absorb those cuts in later years, and how do they address those, or do they use their devolved powers to change revenues?
OK, thank you. And I think one of the issues, of course, which has been well trailed is the freezing of thresholds, and ultimately, by the end of this Parliament, the tax take will be the highest on record in peacetime. Is that correct? As a share of GDP.
Yeah, so the tax to GDP ratio has already risen substantially since before the COVID pandemic, and it is set to rise further during this Parliament. The further increases are in part because of the kind of threshold freezes put in place by the last UK government, which are continuing through till 2028, and then the new threshold freezes that were announced in this year's budget, combined with some of the other tax changes made in last year's budget, particularly the employer national insurance increase. And so, yes, the tax GDP ratio, I think, will increase to, I think it's 38.3% of GDP, which would be the highest outside of the Second World War in the UK context. I think it's notable to kind of point out that that wouldn't kind of leave the UK with a particularly high tax burden in an international, or at least a European context, but it is historically high for the UK. And the reason for that is obviously because spending is historically high in the UK compared to levels we've seen outside of wars as well. So compared to pre-pandemic period, spending as a share of GDP will be up about 5 or 6 percentage points, with that driven partly by higher debt interest, partly by higher spending on pensions, but actually higher spending on public services as well, which unfortunately across the UK in England and Scotland and Wales hasn't delivered the improvements in public services we would have quite hoped for, given what is a disappointing productivity performance for public services.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is underpinned by the fact that, that the productivity forecasts have had to be downgraded, actually, given that they've been over-optimistic for some time. And I think one of the issues about this budget, I think, which has been picked up by many commentators, is the fact that it's there are a lot of little tax increases rather than something particularly significant. So I'm just going to try and touch on one or two of those that maybe haven't been particularly well highlighted. So because simply in terms of implications for Scotland. So increasing the tax on property income and savings income by 2 percentage points at a basic and higher additional rates will take place from April 2027. And the UK Government intends to engage with the devolved governments of Scotland and Wales to provide them with the ability to set property income rates in line with their current income tax powers in their fiscal framework. So I'm just wondering if you can maybe talk to us about that.
Yeah, so a number of changes were made to income tax by the UK Government in the budget. Some of those apply directly in Scotland, some of those don't, and it's up to the Scottish Government to decide whether to follow suit. So the ones that directly apply, the freeze in the person allowance, that's not devolved, and the increases for savings and dividends income applies because that hasn't been devolved. But the freezes and the other thresholds, like the higher rate threshold, that's up to the Scottish Government to decide whether to follow suit. And then with property income, because that has been devolved, by default, the extra tax on property income the UK Government's imposing, that won't apply in Scotland. But as you say, the UK Government is liaising with the Scottish Government about the powers to do that in Scotland, and then it's up to the Scottish Government to follow suit. Now, the kind of point I'd make here, and one of the things the Chancellor kind of made a lot of in her speech, she said that, well, the reason to kind of do this is because unearned income, property income, savings income, dividends income, and so on, is taxed at a lower rate, a lower marginal rate than labour income, and this is designed to bring that into line, or at least a bit more into line. And she is right that there's a lower rate on property income and so on because there's no national insurance on it. But we also need to think about the tax base as well. And what we've seen on property income over time is a significant restriction on the deductions people can make for mortgage interest costs and other things. And by increasing the rates without fixing the tax base for things like savings and dividends and property, you end up discouraging investment more than you need to. So it should have been part of a package of reforms that looks not just at the tax rates, but the tax base, so there are proper deductions for investment. And I think in a Scottish context, with the property tax, I think it is important to see that one in the light of a series of other policies that penalise the rental sector effectively. There's already, restricted mortgage interest relief by the UK Government. There's capital gains tax on the UK Government side. There's LBTT at higher rates from the Scottish Government. So I think there is a kind of question about actually not just kind of looking at the marginal rates, but looking at the whole series of taxes on the private rental sector, realising that restrictions on private or higher taxes on private rental sector don't just affect landlords, they can sometimes affect tenants as well. So I'm not saying you shouldn't follow suit, but I'd say be careful thinking about that, given it kind of interacts with other parts of the tax system, which now mean that the private rental sector is taxed far more highly than most other parts of the economy, and that can have knock-on effects for tenants as well as the landlords.
Yeah, because obviously costs have to be passed on ultimately. Now, in terms of implementing lower business rates for retail, hospitality and leisure properties, there's a lot of pressure on the Scottish Government to follow suit with regard to what's happened down south. So what would be the implications for the Scottish budget if they were to do so?
So let me make a couple of points on the business and hospitality and so on. I think the first thing to kind of point out is that compared to the system now, business rates overall are going up in England. That's because currently the reliefs for retail, hospitality and leisure are reliefs. They're reliefs paid for by central government. Going forwards, what they're doing is they're increasing the tax on higher value properties to then have a discount for retail, hospitality and leisure properties. So it's going from a relief paid for by central government to a discount funded by higher bills on some large properties. So overall, it's an increase in business rates in England. The second point I'd also point out is that amongst those retail, hospitality and leisure, it's actually less generous reliefs for most small businesses. Currently, they can get 40%, up to a cap of 110,000. The new system across England will be about a 12-13% discount, but not capped in the same way. So if you're a big business with lots of properties, you might actually get a better deal. If you're a small business, 11% less good than 40. So that's kind of the background there. What it would mean for the Scottish Government's budget, well, the fact that they've now shifted this from being a rates relief funded by central government to being funded by other ratepayers means that business rates revenues are higher in England. That means a smaller block grant for the Scottish Government, because as business rates revenues kind of go up, that means less money for the Scottish Government. If the Scottish Government wanted to follow suit, it would depend on how it chose to fund it. It could say we're going to do it via a sort of higher rate on those bigger businesses. It could say we're going to do it as a funded relief, like England had traditionally done. And there's different options. You could do what England did, or you could do what Wales did, which is to have a relief just for retailers. Doesn't cover hospitality and leisure, but it's just for retailers. The idea being that it's sort of about sort of helping them compete with online and saying, well, you don't really have quite the same online competition for hotels and for hospitality. I guess you've got Deliveroo, but it's not quite the same. Now, the last thing I'd say on this as well is thinking about what the potential impacts are on the beneficiaries of this policy. So to the extent to which we think that the amount of business property is not that responsive to taxation, what that means, if you have a side of the market that's not very responsive to taxation, say the supply of property, it's that side of the market that bears the tax. So what I think that implies is that if the supply of business property isn't that responsive to taxes, then most of the benefits of a lower tax rate would fall to the landlords. Basically, because it's now cheaper in terms of business rates, retailers and pubs would be able to pay a bit more in rent, and the landlords would capture that. So the landlords would gain. Retailers and hospitality and leisure, they'd gain a bit as well, because their demand would go up, but demand wouldn't be going up from the banks and the others that don't get this relief. So they'd gain a bit. But those banks and others that don't get the relief, they're still paying the same business rates, but they're now competing with retailers that can pay a little bit more, so their rents are going up, so they could be worse off. So in terms of thinking who might gain from this, landlords, the biggest gainers, potentially then the retail, hospitality and leisure ones to some extent, and the losers could be those other sectors that compete for properties with retail, hospitality and leisure, but which don't get those reliefs. So maybe banks and building societies and some of the kind of service providers.
So that might be a further incentive for banks to leave high streets, for example. Not that they seem to need much of an incentive at the moment.
To the extent to which they, if they weren't covered by this relief and rents were to go up, that could be another thing, increasing the cost of their presence on the high street. And yes, it could be an incentive for them. A further incentive for them to leave. So
you said at the very start of your response that this would have an impact on the block grant adjustment. How much is it likely to be in the forthcoming financial year, would you estimate? I
haven't got those figures to hand. I think the last time I looked at the kind of cost of the reliefs in England was they were about £2 billion. Mm-hmm. And so the fact they weren't further extended and they're now being funded, by higher rates on bigger properties, that would be about 200 million if the cost was 2 billion. But I think what I'd need to do is to go away and confirm exactly what the kind of previous cost was, and then it's about 10% of that in terms of what Scotland would have got if they were extended, but isn't because it's being funded in this different way going forwards. So it's potentially about 20 million loss to the Scottish budget or so, roughly. Well, no, if it was 2 billion, it'd be a 200 million loss. Oh, sorry, I thought it was only the 200 million change you were talking about. So let me look at the exact figures. I think those figures would be helpful. Yeah. And the last thing I'd say is that I'd also expect there to be different effects depending on the types of properties as well, because what I said so far was all in the context of supply of property not being that responsive to tax. In some places it could be more responsive. So when it could be more responsive are those marginal bits of the high street where you could perhaps convert it into residential space instead of it being commercial space. There, because it's that more responsive supply side of the property market, you might think a bit more of the gains there go to the tenants. So in the kind of city centres and town centres where this property is only really that useful as retail, it's still much more valuable as retail than residential, mostly on the landlords. But maybe on some of the periphery or some of the kind of small high streets, maybe a bit more there does go to protect the sort of tenant. So again, I might expect it to do a bit more to protect retail, hospitality and leisure in peripheral locations. It'll do more to help the landlords in those central locations where the property is just there and, it doesn't make sense to use it for other things.
Okay, thank you. Now, one of the issues that's created quite a lot of heat and not much light in Scotland is the Energy Profits Levy. And of course, the UK Government plans to replace that levy with a permanent oil and gas profits mechanism. So, how would that work?
Yeah, so I should first kind of preface what I'm going to say by saying I'm not an expert on energy taxation, so please bear that in mind. The new mechanism is going to differ from the current one in that there's going to be a defined set of price points for oil and gas that are higher than the ones that are built into the current mechanism, and the new higher rate will only apply when those points are passed. It'll also differ in the extent that it'll be a revenue-based tax rather than a profits-based tax. So once you kind of reach those price points, the tax rate applies on revenue above that point with no allowance for any additional costs and so on. So it is a bit of a change in regime. I spoke to colleagues about this yesterday, actually, in preparation about this system, and in effect, we think that the taxation of oil and gas is being overcomplicated. Oil and gas is something where it has what's called a location-specific rent. That means that, you can't get the oil and gas anywhere. It's only in certain locations. So unlike something like attracting Nike or attracting Apple to a country, where low tax rates can help attract them in, oil and gas is in certain locations. Companies that want to extract that need to go there. So those are areas where you can have higher taxes than your standard tax regime. So it does make sense to have a higher tax rate on oil and gas than it does on other things that can move more footloose around the world. But rather than having kind of a tax rate and then a different tax that applies when prices are high, then another kind of supplementary regime and so on, which complicates the system and has lots of issues, which I'll come on to in a second, all you need to do is have a high tax rate which applies to profits above the normal rate of return. So you have a high tax rate and then, deductions for the full cost of investment. That high tax rate is only applying to those above normal returns, those above things that cover your investment costs. That does what you wanted to do. It's taxing those kind of excess profits at that high rate. Having a system where you say we have this standard rate which applies, we don't allow for full deduction of costs, but then we'll have this special thing at the top which only applies when a certain price point is reached. We need to define that price point. We need to say how it changes over time. We've not really been very clear how that will evolve, and it's not clear how it will respond to sort of changes in production costs as well as changes in prices. I think that risks overcomplicating things, and we've seen instability in the oil and gas tax regime, which can sometimes increase uncertainty, and potentially that can put off investment. So I think what we need to do in oil and gas is we need to kind of go back to a simpler system, rather than try to have all these add-ons that try to identify times of high prices and excess profits. You can just have a system that's designed to cope with that in the first place by having a high tax rate above full deduction for investment costs.
I mean, it said that a camel is a horse designed by a committee, and that kind of tax system looks exactly like that, as if it's a whole load of people that have sat down and they've all managed to add a wee bit into the mix without it being very clear and straightforward, as you've just said. Now, the OBR forecasts real GDP growth of 1.5% across the UK in 2025, but the economy's shrunk in 6 of the last 7 months. So is that realistic, do you think?
I wouldn't want to comment on that. I think kind of the OBR said that the main reason they upgraded their forecast for this year is because growth at the end of 2024 was stronger than expected, and in the first quarter of this year was stronger than expected, 0.7. So I think what happened is effectively growth coming into the start of the year was stronger than expected, because that then affects the later months in the year as well, because it started from a higher base. It's kind of like, if you like, boosted the sort of growth early on in the year. But I wouldn't want to make a kind of comment about, how things are going to evolve over the next couple of months and how that'll feed through.
But a lot of that was before the employer national insurance increase came in, and there was a theory that people were actually, spending before the 1st of April, and that boosted that quarter's figures, and at the same time had an artificial adverse impact on the following quarter. So one would have thought that over the year they would have taken these matters into account. I mean, surely they must have done.
So, so I wouldn't have expected people to bring forward expenditure for a national insurance increase. If it had been, say, a VAT increase, there would be an incentive to bring spending forward because you then avoid that higher cost of VAT going forward. Whereas on the consumer side, there's no direct impact of the NICs for consumers. They carry pass-through effects in terms of prices. But yes, my understanding is that the upgrade to the forecast was largely because of things happening towards the end of 2024 and the start of 2025, and they think that is enough to kind of boost the overall figure for the year. But they have downgraded their forecast for growth from 2026 onwards, in part because of that productivity downgrade, but actually the downgrade in 2026 is a bit more than just that productivity downgrade. So that could be, responding to some of the more weakness that you've kind of pointed out there in later month's figures. But I think you're seeing the OBR next month, and I think they might be a better place to respond to questions about their forecasts.
Definitely. IFS Director Helen Miller described the budget as a borrow-to-spend budget in the short term and a combination of a tax and spend and tax and bank it budget in the medium term. What did she mean by that?
So, going into this budget and sort of set of fiscal forecasts, the expectation was that this big story would be this downgrade in the kind of fiscal forecast because of this productivity downgrade, and that the Chancellor would have this big fiscal repair job, that she would need to raise taxes to cover a hole that had opened up in her public finances. Now, there was a bit of a downgrade in the public finances, but not as significant as we expected. But she did two things. She then, on top of the sort of downgrade in the forecasts, in the short term, she boosted spending. Some of that was things like, confirming the reversal of the cuts to disability benefits and winter fuel payments. So she kind of put those officially in the figures. She also said we're going to be abolishing the two-child limit. And then she also brought forward some spending on capital and day-to-day spending that you mentioned there. So in the short term, there's this sort of increase in planned spending on welfare and day-to-day spending and capital spending. That then starts to ebb a bit later down. The benefits, the welfare continues, but she's brought forward capital and resource, so they are then lower in subsequent years. And then later on, tax rises kick in. So we've called it, as you said, the another term we've called it is the kind of spend now, pay later budget, where in the short term, in effect, we're spending more and borrowing more than we previously were. And then from 29-30, when the fiscal rules bind, that's when the biggest tax rises kick in, and that's when we're borrowing less than we were going previously. So we've raised taxes partly to spend a bit more, but then partly in the longer term to borrow a bit less. And I think that is kind of where one of the risks is sitting with the budget strategy. In the short term, it's quite believable that we'll see this increase in spending, certainly on the benefit side, the kind of changes are being made on public services and investment. The OBR now expects it to be less underspends than previously because it's seen the pressures in the budget. So the short-term boost to spending is quite believable. The longer-term restraint going into 28 and 29 and 29-30, and then the tax rises coming on stream then as well, that's a bit more risky, given that's in sort of political context of that just before an election. You're going to have heroic spending restraint and tax rises kicking in before the election. I guess the risk then is when you approach that, the Chancellor goes, oh, this looks a bit scary, I'll need to borrow a bit more. And then when you get there, we never actually do deliver that kind of reduction in borrowing that's been penciled in because it's all backloaded.
Well, the IFS blog is quite cynical and says one could be forgiven for treating that with a healthy dose of scepticism, the kind of hair-shirt approach just before an election.
If I could be as bold as to say I was a little bit surprised how sanguine the markets were with this strategy. So, on paper, this strategy does increase the headroom that the Chancellor has against her fiscal rules in 29/30 from 10 billion to 22 billion. Quite a big increase in that headroom. Still fairly small in the grand scheme of things overall. It increases her chances of meeting her main rule to borrow only to invest from, I think it's 53 to 59%. So still a 40% chance that she wouldn't meet that rule. But I think the kind of bigger risk is as you approach that time, that the kind of spending restraint, in particular, that's required just before an election, that looks a lot less appealing as we get closer to it. And I guess we've seen repeated governments do this now, where they pencil in, front-loaded spending increases, then paring back spending growth, and when you get closer to it, they top budgets up, which then eases the pressure on public services, but just means you've got debt and the deficit being ratcheted up every time you approach that moment of reckoning.
Yeah, I noticed that the share of GDP by 2030-31 was still expected to grow from 95 to 96%. Now, in terms of reform, IFS has said that a range of tax increase on pension contributions on our income, business investments and capital gains weaken incentives to save and invest, adding that the Chancellor continues to show no real appetite for using tax reform to boost growth.
Yes. So, a number of the tax changes made, so for example, the new tax rates on property income and savings and investment income, changes to pension contributions relief, changes to capital gains, changes to corporation tax. A number of those, in effect, increase the effective tax rate on savings and investment income. Now, the Chancellor has pointed to the fact that this income is often taxed at lower marginal rates than earned income, and that is true. But we also don't allow full and proper deductions for the costs of investment in many cases. I mentioned already in terms of buy-to-let properties and the sort of property rental sector. And without looking at both the deductions and allowances, the tax base and the tax rates at the same time, just increasing the tax rates does more harm than necessary to incentives to invest than if you looked at the two of those together. I think we shouldn't be, too harsh on Ms Reeves because no Chancellor has been doing that probably for 40-odd years. The last time we had a really reforming sort of set of tax proposals was in the 1980s, I think, And I think what we've seen more recently is kind of a series of ad hoc measures, almost sticking plasters on little bits of the system that don't seem to be working, which sometimes make it better, sometimes just make it a bit worse. So I think, it is fair to say that there hasn't been this appetite for tax reform, and because of that, the tax system is doing more harm to growth than it needs. But I would say that's true in Scotland as well as in the UK as a whole. The Scottish Government has property taxes devolved to it in full, more or less, or the main ones. It's got LBTT, it's got council tax, and it's got business rates. There's a real opportunity there to actually think about how do we design property taxes in a way which is more growth-friendly, distorts people's behaviour less. That would probably involve some form of revalued and reformed council tax, a shift from business rates to land value tax, and probably abolishing LBTT or at least reducing it substantially and raising the revenue through other means. The Scottish Government hasn't touched that either. I think basically we're in a world where politicians are scared of creating losers. And because they haven't got a strong narrative about why they're doing certain things, like we had in the 1980s perhaps, or like the Scottish Government had with income tax, where it did make changes which did create losers, but it had a strong narrative behind it, because we've not seen that narrative for reform at a UK level or Scottish level, we're not making those changes that could benefit growth, either in the UK or here in Edinburgh.
Okay, last question from me before colleagues come in. You've talked about as the medium-term financial strategy and Scottish Fiscal Commission make clear current broad forecasts for the contribution of all tax revenues to the Scottish budget are likely optimistic as they assume earnings grow significantly faster in Scotland and the rest of the UK from 26-27. All else being equal, if earnings instead grew at the same rate as the rest of the UK, the funding gap for day-to-day spending in Scotland would be closer to £3.5 billion.
Yeah, so the fundamental issue here is that the way the fiscal framework works is that the forecasts for Scottish revenues are made by the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and it's their forecasts for Scottish revenues which then determine the outlook for the Scottish budget, but also what the Scottish Government gets allocated, if you like, at the start of each year as it's forecasted devolved tax revenues. On the other hand, though, the block grant adjustments that are subtracted from the Scottish Government to account for devolution, well, they're based on OBR forecasts for revenues for the UK as a whole. And it happens to be the case that after 2026, I think it is, the SFC is just much more optimistic about earnings growth than the OBR. When I last looked, the SFC was predicting earnings growth to be about 3 to 3.5% a year. The OBR had it trending down to 2 to 2.5% a year. The OBR's view was that that was needed because over some time we'd seen earnings grow faster than the economy, and that there'd be a bit of a reversion to mean, so that earnings remained the same share of the economy for a period. Earnings would grow less quickly than the economy, so earnings growth would be subdued. SFC said we've seen no evidence of that in the past. We're going to assume that earnings still grow a bit stronger. But that isn't because they think earnings in Scotland will grow stronger than earnings in the rest of the UK. They're just more optimistic about earnings more generally. So you've got one forecast use of revenues which is more optimistic than the other forecasts used for block grant adjustments. And that means that the current projection for the gap between revenues and the block grant adjustment has an, if you like, optimism bias built into it. Now, when looking at that, using figures from the SFC about what each % of earnings growth means to revenues, we estimated that the gap between the SFC's earnings forecast and the OBR's earnings forecast was equivalent to about £900 million a year by, I think it was 2029. So that increased the sort of fiscal gap, which in the MTFS was, I think, initially 2.6 billion to that 3.5 billion. But the impact of the income tax performance gap, if you like, the extra revenue that you'd get if it did outpace growth in earnings in the rest of the UK, in line with OBR, in line with SFC forecasts, that was £900 million, which, I guess, to put it in context, is about 1.5 to 2% of the Scottish Government's resource budget.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open up the session now. John, to be followed by Craig.
Thank you very much. Convener, the Convener's asked you a number of things already, but I can maybe just touch on a few more. I mean, the 38% of GDP that's going on tax, how does that compare to, you said it's not that high compared to other countries. Can you give us any examples of other countries?
So I don't have the exact figures for other countries to hand, but places in Scandinavia, France, I think Belgium, they'd have higher taxes. It would be a little bit higher, perhaps in Germany, but not much higher. Places like Ireland, Australia, Canada, the US would have lower taxes, as would Japan and Korea. So we'd be sort of probably a little bit below the Western European average still, but above the OECD overall average, which is sort of lower in part because America is a large share of the OECD economy, has much lower taxes.
So somewhere like Denmark, we often think is probably got higher taxes.
They would have higher taxes, and France and...
I mean, are they tending to increase theirs as well, or is it...
We have seen a larger increase than most countries in recent years. We've moved from sort of, you see it on the debt as well. We've moved from kind of like a sort of relatively low debt to a kind of relatively high debt country over time, and we've been moving from a relatively low tax to a relatively higher tax country over time. But that is a different trend. Basically, what happened is that most countries increased their tax as a share of GDP from, say, the 1960s to the 2000s. We didn't really do that. So there's some extent where, if you like, playing a bit of catch-up on that. We had a bigger peace dividend than most countries did. We previously spent a lot more on defence than most of Western Europe in the 1950s and 60s. When that was coming down, that allowed us to spend more on pensions and health without putting up taxes. Now that's ended, and now we're still seeing the rising costs of health, pensions, and this higher debt interest payments. that's why our taxes have been going up, and why it doesn't feel like we're getting more for that money. Because basically we're paying, whereas for 50 years we had more butter because we had less guns, we're now having to get guns and butter at the same time.
Okay, good line. I mean, most of the Western countries, and certainly ours, we've got an ageing population. So, I mean, apart from anything else, you would kind of expect public expenditure to increase for that reason over time.
Yeah, and so when it comes to looking at the long-term public finance projections, the ageing population is certainly one aspect of it. That pushes up spending on pensions. It also pushes up spending on health. But for the health sector, actually, a larger share of the increase in spending that's projected is not directly because of ageing. It's what economists call Baumol's cost disease, and it's what everyone else calls the sort of low productivity growth in labour-intensive services. Right. So traditionally, things like health, things like social care, which are very labour-intensive, you can't get the same productivity improvements from those as you can from manufacturing or IT or other things where you can put more technology into it. So as the rest of the economy grows and you get productivity increases, and then that pushes up wages, in order to kind of continue to deliver healthcare, you need to compete with other sectors in terms of wages, and that pushes up the wage bill of the health sector. So historically speaking, one of the bigger factors underlying rising costs for healthcare has not been the ageing population. It's been that you need to keep pace with wages in the wider economy, which have traditionally been going up more. And then there's, kind of new treatments. In many areas, technology can kind of reduce costs. Often in healthcare, it's increased costs because you can treat more things than you otherwise couldn't with more costly treatments. So the reason I mentioned that is that the SFC had a really good paper earlier this year, which I see they've put a correction out to, but it's still a good paper, looking at kind of how differences in population health could change things going forward. Yes, that's really true. Yes. I think just as important, perhaps even more important for the pressures coming through from the health service to public finances will be public sector productivity and productivity in the health service. And can some of the new technologies that are kind of being developed around, diagnostics using kind of, AI and so on, can some of those actually boost productivity and kind of help doctors do more with the time they have, so that you don't need to kind of see quite such a large increase in the medical workforce, and actually you can kind of redeploy some of those resources. So I would say it's not just the ageing population that's putting up pressure, it's a traditionally low productivity growth of labour-intensive services. If we can make those services a bit less labour-intensive through the application of technology, the pressures on the health budget won't be as big going forwards.
Okay, there's quite a lot in that. You sounded a little bit pessimistic earlier on that public services on the whole are difficult to improve productivity. Have other countries kind of cracked this? Or are our health services much like Germany, America, elsewhere?
So, in general, again, this is not my particular area of expertise, but my understanding is that in general, the UK health services have been relatively productive compared to most other countries. Given the amount of inputs we put in, we've traditionally had a relatively high volume of outputs. We have fewer nurses and fewer doctors and fewer beds in most countries, yet we've delivered, comparatively high levels of output from that. But I think what has happened is that the UK health service has suffered a bit more than most from a kind of post-COVID hangover when it comes in terms of productivity. And I think in part that might have been because we saw a bigger reduction in activity during COVID. One of the things we did a lot in the UK during COVID was stopped a lot of sort of standard activity to make sure there was spare capacity in case there was a big surge in COVID admissions. And you can see why we did that, but that meant there was quite a big pause in treatments and so on, and also a change in working practices that's been hard to kind of overcome. So I don't have the latest figures to hand, but when we looked at this a while ago, resources for the sort of Scottish NHS, staffing resources were up about 10 to 12%, but the kind of treatment volumes were no higher than before COVID. Yeah. I think that's where we've differed a bit from other countries. So I don't think historically we've been a worse productivity performer. If anything, a little bit better than average on productivity, but we did badly during COVID and have struggled to recover from COVID, I think, more than most.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. Debt was mentioned as well earlier, 96% of GDP. Should that be worrying us?
Yes, shortly. I mean, I think kind of when the debt to GDP, well, so when debt interest rates were much lower, that wasn't a sort of particularly challenging thing to service fiscally. But with debt interest rates as they are now, I think we're spending something like 3.5% to 4% of national income on debt interest costs. As I mentioned, the plans as they stand have debt as a share of national income just falling towards the end of the forecast horizon, but they're based on fairly heroic assumptions of spending restraint just before the next election, which I think as we get closer and as the forecast sort of the target date for the budget surplus recedes, I think there'll be strong pressure to borrow more because, well, you can, because the debt target now isn't binding in 29-30, but in 31-32, so you can borrow a bit more in the short term. So I think there is this risk of borrowing and debt ratcheting up a bit. If we are then faced with another large shock, which leads to a big decline in revenues or a big increase in spending, we're starting from that higher level of debt with that higher level of debt servicing costs, which makes it harder to kind of do an effective response. So, yes, I think we should be concerned about the high levels of debt. I think we probably should be more ambitious in the medium term, at least, on bringing down debt, which means running a bigger surplus on our current budget, at least, than Ms Reeves has penciled in. Not only would that give her even more sort of headroom against her fiscal rules, it would also help, bring down debt to a somewhat more manageable level so we can respond more effectively to shocks. But, of course, that requires either, more tax rises or more spending cuts. So it's not a kind of, it's certainly not painless in any sense.
So that kind of buffer of 22 billion really isn't all that much or isn't sufficient, probably.
So 22 billion as a buffer, in terms of the kind of, there's two ways to think about it. In terms of the kind of extent to which it gives you confidence that you actually will meet the kind of the rule, or that you will reduce, you will run a budget surplus in that year, you've got a 59% chance of doing it with that 22 billion headroom. So 40% chance of not, 60% chance effectively of making it. So it's better than we were in before, but it's still not a particularly large bit of headroom. It's 0.6% of GDP, which is smaller than the amount of headroom that most chancellors left for most budgets up until the COVID pandemic. The other thing is that because we've got a high level of debt and because we have got actually fairly substantial borrowing for capital purposes, we are borrowing quite a bit to invest, our debt-GDP ratio isn't coming down much. So if you wanted to be running a surplus to bring down debt more quickly, it's not doing that much. Okay. So I think kind of if you wanted to have, a genuinely large buffer to kind of, cope with bigger shocks, and you wanted to be bringing down your debt at a more meaningful pace, you'd be looking to kind of raise that from, 20 billion to 40, 50 billion.
Okay, right. That's helpful, thank you. I mean, moving on to some of the Scottish figures more, you say you've been looking at the Scottish Spending Review, and there's a suggestion that, the four key priorities of the government are there's going to have some trade-off between them, poverty, climate change, economic growth, effective public services. Can you explain why you think there might need to be a trade-off?
So, the context of that is the tough sort of, fiscal outlook for the Scottish Government in line with the wider UK position. So when we looked at this back in May, the the overall increases that the Scottish Government could expect in its resource budget over the next 4 years averaged about 1% above inflation, I think it was, at that point. But then there would be increases above that for social security benefits, given rising caseloads for disability benefits, and at that stage at least, plans to mitigate the 2-child limit and so on. And that meant the amount available for public services, I think, was going up by 0.2, 0.3% a year. Now, when you count that health probably needs 2 to 3% a year to kind of like make its rising pressures, that would mean cuts to other areas. So what I was saying is that in the context of a budget which will require cuts almost certainly on average outside the NHS, you can't, feasibly say we're going to achieve all of these different goals to the full extent you want. You will need to make trade-offs, not just between your priorities and everything else, but within your priorities. What is your real top priority? Let's invest most in that, and then let's be a bit more ruthless on the other ones, because Scottish Government's in a world where it will be having to make cuts to a range of services. Whether we'll see that in the spending review published alongside the budget in January, I don't know. That close to an election, there could be a temptation, if you like, to kind of kick the can down the road slightly till after the election, and sort of, produce a set of figures which is, a little bit more like salami sliced. Mm-hmm. But, when real kind of plans are set out, whether that's before or after the election, I think they will require some pretty ruthless prioritisation, because you won't be able to achieve everything you want on child poverty, net zero, growth and public services.
Fair enough. And my final point, you also mentioned prevention and early intervention as being important. From your angle, do you see any change? Do you see any movement on that? Do you think there's more being spent on prevention and early intervention? Or?
I think it's hard to say at this stage. I mean, the MTFS and the Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan both mention kind of a shift in resources to prevention. I think kind of why we expect to see more detail on that was the spending review. So I think kind of so far there's a lot of warm words around it, but I think that the sort of the initial tasting of the pudding will be in the spending review, and the proof of it is the delivery of the spending review.
Okay. Thanks so much. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Craig, to be followed by Liz.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Mr Phillips. In terms of the overall budget, obviously the Chancellor trailed a lot of what was going to be in the budget, or what she thought was going to be in the budget, and that didn't then materialise in some respects. And in relation to tax, alarm bells started to ring here in Scotland around the suggestion that income tax rates were going to rise, because obviously under the fiscal framework that had been the first time there had been an increase in tax, and it suddenly dawned upon observers here that that would potentially mean a material cut to the block grant. That didn't happen, so we now have both governments that are really leaning in on thresholds as the means by which they're raising tax. We know, we've seen it through the Scottish tax system, is that there's been significant behavioural change where the Scottish Government has increased tax rates or brought in new tax rates. What happens to behaviour when governments raise tax by simply freezing thresholds?
Yes. So, as with all tax changes, one would expect there to be a behavioural response. Now, there's a couple of different behavioural responses you'd expect to see. Most people are able to kind of precisely tune their incomes to kind of like get their income just below a particular threshold. If you're an employee, it's very hard to kind of, negotiate with your employer to get an exact amount of money, or to change your hours a little bit to get you just below this higher rate threshold, or just below this additional rate threshold, or so on. But there are some groups that can do that more easily. So you tend to see it's actually more for company owner managers. So on savings and dividends taxation, you see a lot of bunching below the higher rate threshold, particularly below the 100,000 point where the personal allowance starts to get tapered away. A lot of people that own their own businesses will arrange it so that they take out just enough income to be just below that threshold, and then hold income within the company and pay it out again next year. So again, they're just below the threshold. So you do see that sort of income smoothing or that sort of income optimization amongst those that can do it, particularly company owner managers. More generally, to the extent to which you're increasing average effective tax rates, you might expect there to be some behaviour responses. People that are, dragged into personal tax for the first time, or people that are dragged into the higher rate, at the margin an extra £1 now, rather than facing a tax rate of, it would be in Scotland, if they were to freeze, if in Scotland you were to freeze the higher rate threshold as well, rather than a marginal tax rate being, what would it be? Rather than it being 8 plus 21, rather than it being 29, you'd be doing 50, I think it is. So paying 50p in the pound extra in tax for an extra bit of earnings rather than 29p, that'll reduce your incentive a bit to earn that little bit more. But I'd expect there to be a smaller response to the threshold freezes than I would to changing the tax rates. Yeah. So I'd expect there to be a bigger response to changes in tax rates, particularly at the very top, where people have more margins to respond, than I would there to be a freeze in the thresholds. Because those freeze in the thresholds only affect the marginal rate for those people around the threshold, whereas the increase in an actual tax rate affects the marginal rate for a much wider group of people.
Yeah, that's something we discussed with the Auditor General last week. Over the last 10 to 15 years, though, the freezing of thresholds, particularly in Scotland, where obviously there are new tax rates being introduced, means that more and more people are actually being dragged into the higher rates of tax. So it's gone from the upper rate of tax rather than the Scottish top rate. Used to be in single figures, between now and the end of the decade, it could be approaching sort of 40% plus. How does that compare with other comparative nations in terms of where the tax base falls in relation to the different tax rates?
So I don't have the figures to hand for nations outside of the UK. In general, middle earners face lower taxes in the UK than they do in other countries, not because of income tax, but because of social security contributions. In most other countries, social security contributions are quite a bit higher for middle earners than they are here. So if you look at someone on earnings sort of between 2/3 and twice the average earnings, people in the UK pay less tax than those in most Western European countries. That's less true at the very top. Our taxes at the very top are more comparable to taxes at the very top in Western European countries. It's sort of middle earners where we're relatively low taxed compared to most countries. Where we tax more highly than most countries is property tax. We raise more through council tax and business rates than other countries do from equivalent taxes. Scotland would differ a bit because in Scotland the tax rates are marginally higher once you kind of get above, I think it's about £30,000. But then once you get above £43,000, that's when they really start kicking up. And when we looked at this back in 2020, the start of this year actually, when we looked at the tax strategy, someone on £125,000 pays about £5,000 more a year in income tax in Scotland, which is about 7% of net income. So at the bottom end, there's that small, increase in income in Scotland because there's 19p tax rate. For those around 45, 50,000, there's a bit of an increase. At the top, there's substantially higher taxes in Scotland.
We found out recently from data that if the Scottish Government was to increase the advance rate by 1 pence, it would only actually yield about £5 million. It would be a very small amount of money relative to what they would initially estimate or what you might think. How concerned should we be in Scotland about the profile of our tax base relative to the rest of the UK, where an increase of that level would bring in such a relatively small amount of money?
Yeah, so compared to the rest of the UK, Scotland actually does reasonably well compared to most regions when it comes to incomes and hence the tax base. Scotland is sort of, if it were a region of England, would probably be fourth when it comes to kind of the strength of the tax base behind London, the South East and the East of England. You'd then probably have Scotland. Substantially stronger tax base than the Midlands and the north of England, and much more strong than Wales, my home country. But of course, it means that, given it's kind of, fourth, and given it's behind London and the South East, where there's by far the highest concentration of those high income earners, the fact that you haven't got as many high income earners in Scotland means you can raise less from that very top. But I think the kind of bigger reason why you can raise less from that very top section is that marginal tax rates are already pretty high on that group, and combined with the fact that they are pretty responsive to tax policy, as shown by sort of evidence from the UK and from other countries, you tend to see a greater degree of response by high earners, not necessarily their labour supply, but a whole range of factors through tax avoidance and changing the form of remuneration and changing how they organise their affairs and so on. You can't raise so much from them. So if the Scottish Government wanted to raise a substantial amount through income tax, trying to do that through a large increase on the highest earners, I think, could end up being counterproductive. I think, if you wanted to raise a significant amount from income tax, it needs to be a sort of a broader-based tax increase. But of course, that then does mean, people on more average incomes paying more tax as well.
Yeah. Just, you highlighted this earlier, that you think the way in which the UK government has structured the budget is probably unrealistic and certainly not electorally sound in respect to the fact that they'll be looking at potentially the greatest spending cuts or tax increases coming in the year before an election. You then alluded to the issue in relation to the spending review here in Scotland. Let's say the UK government doesn't manage to have the spending restraint that they're thinking. That then does provide the Scottish Government with some additional funds towards the end of this UK Parliament. But both governments say they're determined to rein in on public expenditure, particularly in relation to administration costs, and you identify the £1 billion that the Scottish Government has identified. How likely do you think it is that both the Scottish and the UK governments will actually be able to rein in expenditure in that area? What impression are you getting of the work that's going on behind the scenes to prevent, as you said, this being simply a salami slicing exercise where you cut productive parts of government?
Yeah, so again, I don't really have any kind of particular insight to what's happening within the Scottish Government on this. What I'd say is that I hope the Scottish Government takes a different approach to cutting the administration budgets of its different departments than the UK Government did. The UK Government gave most departments basically the same cut to its admin budgets, irrespective of what had been happening to its broader budgets. And of course, if you're a department which in general is seeing its activities increase, probably you can't make such a big cut to your admin budget than another department which is seeing its sort of other activities being cut back. So I would like to see a different approach from the Scottish Government than, to some extent, the salami slicing approach that the UK Government took to administration budgets. Whether we'll see that degree of detail in the spending review in Scotland, I'm not sure, because one thing that you can see in the UK budget documentation, they do actually do a separate sort of like administration's budget set of tables. Traditionally, for the Scottish budget, I don't think that administration budgets are separated out in that way. You've got the sort of detailed tables underlying the kind of main departments, but identifying which of these is actually in that £5 billion figure that the Scottish Government says is for administration and is subject to that £1 billion of cuts, at least to me, hasn't been clear. So I think making clear what is within the scope of that £1 billion cut, and then making clear where those cuts are falling and how that aligns with your ambition on the services in each of those areas. So, if it's one of the priorities that you're really prioritising to say to tackle child poverty, that probably isn't an area where you can make as big a cut to the admin budget as you can to another area which you're deprioritising. So I'd expect to see that. And the second thing to say is that we have seen periods where there have been, efficiencies generated in the public sector. Public sector productivity did reasonably well during the 2010s compared to its historic performance, in part because we were cutting back and sort of had to make do and mend. And as you were kind of cutting back it sort of forced to some extent some productivity improvements. In this world of spending restraint, I think I'd expect there to again to be some push towards productivity improvements. I think that kind of question is, will they be on the scale that the UK government and potentially the Scottish government are saying they want to deliver? The plans put in place in the UK spending review were equivalent to a 1% productivity improvement across the board. So that wasn't just on the admin, that was on the actual operations as well. 1% a year improvement in productivity each year. That's quicker than we've delivered even during the kind of like austerity of the 2010s, when I think the productivity improvements were about 0.7, 0.8% a year. So already what was penciled in the spending review was quite ambitious. The UK government's now saying another £4.5 billion of productivity improvements on top of that by 2030. That's really quite ambitious. I guess the open question is, we don't know yet how changes in technology will affect what is feasible. So, what will AI and Gen AI and so on mean for productivity? There's some real optimists there, and I speak to people in councils, my role on local government, and some of those have suggested huge productivity improvements in certain areas of council operations by using Gen AI. I don't know whether that is replicatable, whether that is just for small niche areas or not. But based on historic evidence, the plans for productivity improvements are really ambitious already, and set to be even more ambitious. Will things be different now? Maybe, but if not, it'll be a struggle to deliver these savings.
Yeah. Just turning briefly to welfare, the UK government has stepped back from the bold welfare reforms that initially they planned. The Scottish Government didn't have plans for those, and the two governments in relation to the two-child benefit cap, for example, are now sort of proceeding in lockstep. How concerned should we be that this area of expenditure, which the government classes as demand-led, is difficult to tackle over the medium to long term? And is there a risk that if the government gets seriously financially constrained, as we see it does by 2030-31, is that it starts to cut other areas because it simply cannot cut those demand-led areas? In fact, the demand could be going in the opposite direction, as we're seeing, for example, when unemployment's rising at the moment.
Yes. So a couple of different answers there. At a UK level, overall working age welfare has been pretty stable, actually, in recent years. But that's reflecting two things. We've seen a fall in the non-disability benefits expenditure and an increase in the disability and incapacity benefits expenditure. And of course, what is devolved to Scotland is the disability benefits expenditure. It's the part that is going up. Now, I'm not sure I'd go as far as to say that, obviously, the UK government has cancelled its initial set of proposals on reforming PIP. There is a review of PIP due to report, and there are still plans, in motion to reform how disability assessments work, so that to kind of merge the PIP assessment with what is used for disability for universal credit. That could pose some issues for Scotland, because obviously there's a different disability assessment, which is in some ways, a little bit less stringent than the UK assessment. Would the UK government be happy to use that in assessing universal credit or not? We don't know yet. So there's an issue coming down the line there. So I'm just saying that to say that whilst they've shelved their initial plans to kind of cut PIP, I'm not sure at the end of the road with potential reforms to disability benefits at the UK level. When it comes to the kind of current kind of trajectories for disability benefit spending and benefit spending in general, the pressures on the Scottish Government's resource budget, are being increased to some extent by rising caseloads for disability benefit spending in Scotland, and obviously the additional benefits the Scottish Government chooses to pay out on Scottish child payment and so on and so forth. so on and so forth. But it's made if you like, a legitimate decision to... Sorry, can I... it's made a legitimate decision to prioritise spending on child poverty and a different assessment process for disability benefits. That comes with a kind of fiscal cost. Meeting those costs, you're right, there's a decision for the Scottish Government to take as to, does it address those costs through higher taxation, lower spending elsewhere, or at some stage does it look at the system and say, well, actually, this is costing more than we thought, maybe more people are getting this than we thought should or would, let's look at the assessment process. Now, buried in the MTFS or the Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan, I can't remember which one it was, there was one line in there about the reassessment process for Scottish disability payments, where it said that more people are kind of remaining on these benefits than we expected and we'll keep this under review. So I think that the Scottish Government also is looking a bit, at least, at the reassessment process for adult disability payment, where at least at one stage, very, very few people were kind of moving off it when they were reaching reassessment. Far fewer than even in England, where that share moving off has been declining quite a bit over time. So I think that there might be some concern within government about that particular aspect, and that could be an area where maybe would see reform coming forward in the next couple of years.
Super. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Liz, to be followed by Ross.
Thank you. Could I ask a more general question, Mr Phillips? Just to quote the Auditor General, to ask whether you agree with this comment. He told us that the Scottish budget process, and I quote, is neither sufficiently transparent nor is the Scottish Government sufficiently accountable for the decision it makes. Do you agree with that?
So it depends on kind of what aspect they mean there. I think kind of compared to where we were a while ago, we are now getting more information from the Scottish Government on its medium-term strategy and the plans it wants to make to address some of the fiscal pressures it's facing, although there's still huge amounts of detail to be worked out in the spending review and beyond. We're still in the world where, last year I was a bit disappointed with the budget documentation in that finally, they listened to this committee and to people like us and put a table buried at the back which compared spending plans to the most recent spending plans for the current year. But then ministers, when we were talking about increases in spending on NHS, were still comparing them to the initial plans. And then there were other tables in the document which didn't compare plans on a like-for-like basis. So for the NHS, you had a number of, I think, 1.3 billion at the back of the document. That was a real increase in NHS spending. Ministers were talking about 2 billion, which was comparing it to the initial budgets set at the start of the previous year. And there was a table in the sort of main body of the document which had 2 billion, which was calculated in another different way. So there was kind of three numbers kind of floating around, all for the increase in NHS spending, and ministers cherry-picked the one that kind of give them the sort of best number to talk about. So I mentioned that in that I still think there's room for improvement on being clear about actually how is spending changing and how does that compare to what we've been historically spending, to get a real sense about would this money be sufficient or insufficient or so on for different services. But did they mean something a little bit different?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I think we are getting slightly more information than we've had in previous budgets. I think the Auditor General's point, though, is when it comes to assessing how effective the tax take is in relation to in relation to their priorities, he's of the opinion that we're not sufficiently transparent in knowing exactly how that tax take is coming in to ensure that the priorities that the government has put before the public are actually implemented. And just to take up the point from my colleague Mr Mason earlier, when he's saying that there might be some trade-offs in the four priorities, I think the Auditor General is expecting a bit more transparency from the government about that. Would you accept that?
Okay, yeah. Again, I might not be interpreting this entirely correctly because I've not seen the Auditor General's full set of comments there. But I agree with the point that when it comes to setting out a kind of fiscal strategy, as well as actually kind of setting out your priorities, you do need to kind of say how you would respond to changes in circumstances. So one thing that's kind of like lacking a little bit from the Scottish Government, I think, is looking ahead. If revenues come in less strong or more strong than expected, how would we respond to that? How would we change what we do to account for changes in circumstances? And how is what we're doing at the moment responding to the circumstances as they've evolved? So to kind of, be kind of clear, in the kind of MTFS, and the Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan, one of the kind of Scottish Government's strategies to kind of help close the gap is to grow revenues even faster than they currently forecast to grow. What is the strategy to do that? And if that doesn't kind of come forward, how do you respond to that? Do you increase taxes or do you cut back spending? And if so, which parts do you cut back on? I think, to be fair, not many countries, not many governments do that. They like to keep their kind of options open to kind of respond to circumstances as they arise. But in the context where you have a government which doesn't have the kind of full set of fiscal flexibilities that, the UK government, if things go wrong for the UK government, to some extent it can, if it needs to, borrow a bit more. Scottish Government can't do that. So I think there is more onus on the Scottish Government to, in that case, say, this is how you'll respond to these different contingencies, so that people have a sense of what it's, not just what its kind of plan A is, but what is its plan B and plan C.
I think it's entirely right that they keep their options open about what they will plan for in the future. Where I think there is an issue is that in terms of the policies that have already been put into an effect, which of these are giving the greatest benefit in determining how effective the policies are in terms of delivery? That's really the point that's been flagged up to us.
Yeah. So on that, yes, I think in general, governments are poor at kind of like evaluating the effectiveness of their policies. It is hard to kind of like look at the effectiveness of policies which all interact with each other. So, if you're looking at the impact of, policies on economic growth, how do you disentangle the effect of policy A from policy B from policy C is really hard. But I think you're right that, certainly on its kind of major priority areas, government should be doing more to evaluate and then, being a bit more ruthless in culling policies that don't work. I'll stray into a controversial area here, and I'm not saying the Scottish Government should do this, but I think when looking at kind of like spending pressures within the Scottish Government's budget, one area I think that, doesn't particularly align with its various set of priorities is higher education policy. And actually taking an honest, hard look at, is higher education policy meeting the needs of universities, meeting the needs of students, meeting the needs of public finances? That's exactly the kind of thing that if you were doing a zero-based resource kind of spending review, you would do that. I'm not sure that is happening, because I think there are certain things which are perhaps seen as, even if they're not in line with our priorities, even if we don't think they're meeting the objectives, they're politically totemic. You might choose to keep them, but they should be subject to that kind of a review and then justify why you've kept them rather than...
Yeah, well, I think that's the view overall of the Auditor General and the Scottish Fiscal Commission, is they want to have a little bit more transparency about exactly that point. So thank you for your comments there.
Thank you very much. Ross, to follow by Michael.
Thanks, Convener. Just following up on that point, David, around being able to track from the input to the output and disentangle these policies and the impact that they have. There's one particular policy that I was maybe a little bit surprised by the IFS's reaction to, and it was around the road user charging for electric vehicles. So if I'm recalling your comments at the time correctly, it was welcoming that the Chancellor was doing something in that space, though albeit it was quite heavily caveated that this is probably not the ideal way of doing it. Because to me, there's quite a disconnect there, in that there is an argument for road user charging across the board, but to single out EVs for it, the government's own, UK government's own projection shows that will depress EV uptake by about 300,000 or 400,000. That blows a hole in their climate targets, as well as the Scottish Government's climate targets, both of which are really heavily dependent on reducing combustion engine cars. I think the Scottish Government had a 20% car reduction target. It's dropped that, but still has the ambition in that space. And the Chancellor's doing that alongside effectively still freezing fuel duty. OK, she's going to gradually reverse the 5p temporary cut from Sunak, but fuel duty is still going to then, even at the end of that, be at its 2010 levels. Is there not quite a disconnect there, in that that's a policy that, OK, it will raise revenue, albeit through an administratively quite complex mechanism, but it will take the government backwards in other areas where it has put itself under quite strict statutory obligations?
So I think this is kind of a couple of points to kind of make here. The first is that most of the externalities, if you like, associated with driving are not the carbon emissions that cars create. If you were to have a tax just on motor vehicles just for carbon, it would be set at a lower rate than our current rate of fuel duty. Most of the externalities associated with driving are congestion externalities. The fact that when you have lots of cars drive on busy roads, it creates delays that impact on other people, and you account for the fact that it'll take you longer to drive in a traffic jam, but not that you're going to make the traffic jam worse and impact on other people. Bearing that in mind, I think you can kind of see, if you like, part of the fuel duty that that kind of petrol and diesel-driven cars already pay is, if you like, kind of, you know, part of that is for their kind of carbon emissions, part of that is for like particulate emissions, part of that is for kind of like the congestion type emissions. And so, if you like, this is bringing in a charge which is, I think, in the end, about half, it works out about half the kind of like average tax that you'd get for a petrol car per mile. And more than half of the cost is sort of the congestion cost. The carbon cost is sort of probably 10-15%, I think, of the or even less than that, of the externalities associated with driving. That's kind of the first thing I'd make. The second point I'd make is that, yes, you know, we've been clear that we think that it's good that the Chancellor has sort of taken some first steps to kind of think about the taxation of vehicles as you move from petrol to electric. The longer you leave it, the harder it gets to kind of bring something in, the longer people have been used to not paying anything. But that, you know, it is still really not that well targeted against what we're really trying to tax, which is congestion. You know, there's large parts of Scotland in particular where there's no one else on the road, you're not causing any congestion externality. You know, ideally that would not be taxed. Driving into Edinburgh in rush hour or Glasgow, you know, rather than it being 3p a mile, you're probably causing the equivalent of £1 or £2 a mile in terms of the cost on other people. However, you know, we're aware that not only is it technological, but sort of, if you like, you know, sort of privacy concerns about actually, you know, doing dynamic road pricing, which is kind of monitoring where and when different people are driving. The last point I'd say there as well is that I think this change did come alongside, you know, a set of other changes which are expected to boost take-up of electric vehicles. Not to the same extent this depresses them. But one thing I think people haven't kind of fully borne in mind is that the sort of mandates for vehicle producers will still be in place. And they set shares of vehicles that have to be electric. In terms of sales, or you need to pay fines. So unless the motor vehicle producers are going to be paying these fines, as well as slightly depressing sales of electric vehicles, in order so that the share of motor vehicles that are electric doesn't reduce, it will also slightly depress sales of petrol vehicles. What that means is it's not that there'll be fewer cars, that people will keep their old cars a bit longer, and there could be some more polluting cars on the road. Usually it's not so much the carbon emissions, more on the actual particulate emissions. The older cars that stay on the road tend to be worse in terms of particulates. So where does that end us up? Yeah, look, this will have some, you know, potential negative knock-on effects to the environment, probably through keeping those older, slightly more polluting diesel and petrol vehicles on the road slightly longer. But the reason why we said that we thought that in net this was a step in the right direction was that for too long, you know, no one's been willing to tackle this issue about how do we tax road use post petrol vehicles, not just in terms of the externalities, but in terms of the revenue we're going to be losing. This was a small step in that direction, but we think there's a lot more to be done to kind of like fix this area of tax.
Thank you. What about the question around fuel duty itself? Allowing for, yes, well, there is the gradual reversal of the 5p temporary charge, but that's still taken back to 2010.
So on that, I mean, I think the main thing I'd say there is that, you know, the pantomime of kind of like a supposedly temporary freeze that has been extended, you know, for a year, every year for 15 years is sort of ridiculous. It kind of means that you've got this kind of public finance kind of picture partly built on a house of cards, because it assumes that from 2027 we're going to be having these inflation-linked increases to fuel duty, which we haven't done for years. So on that, I think, look, the Chancellor should either say, look, this is frozen indefinitely and that's the plan, or should, you know, get the kind of gumption to actually start increasing the fuel duty in line with inflation at least.
Thanks. Switching to a totally different area, just around national insurance, obviously various changes have been made by both the Labour government but also the last couple of years of the Conservative government, tweaks around national insurance. A lot of the Chancellor's changes seem to be driven with the kind of main objective being raise revenue without making the income tax changes that would have been the most politically unpalatable. Given that, though, why do you think they've not touched the upper earnings limit? It seems like, in terms of, OK, there's potentially political pain from any of these options, but in terms of the potential revenue that could be raised from adjustments to the upper earnings limit, a lot of the other changes that have been made around the salary sacrifice and things, it's a much lower yield for probably the same amount of political pain.
So I think there's a couple of reasons there. I think the reason they've not wanted to increase the tax rate above the upper earnings limit is because they've been trying to avoid increases in tax rates for VAT, NICs, income tax. They felt more comfortable making other changes. Now, for income tax, I think, okay, they have now, they have now increased, with dividends and so on, but for the main rates for kind of like main sources of income, they can say, well, we've met our manifesto pledge there because that was based on the rates of income tax. For NICs, it didn't actually say we'll not increase the rates of NICs. It says we will not increase NICs. So any of these changes, technically break the manifesto pledge not to increase NICs. I think they've taken a judgment that actually increasing a rate is more obviously a breach than changing other things that increase the amount that people pay. Why not increase the threshold of the upper earnings limit? I think because it's aligned with the higher rate threshold in England, and that means you get this kind of like, slightly, it took a long time to align both the sort of the lower threshold with the personal allowance and the upper threshold with the higher rate.
The graph gets jagged in the way it is here.
Yeah, and which I think, people can kind of over sort of, they can make it into a bigger deal than it actually is, but I think that has been a factor. They kind of want to kind of maintain that kind of neat structure to avoid actually a kind of a period in which, you have a high marginal rate. Because if you were to increase, the threshold, like you have in Scotland, you have that part where there's a 42 and then an 8% NICs, a 40 and then 8% employee NICs in England. I think they're trying to avoid having that kind of, combined rate of, 28, 48, back down to 42 or 41. They're trying to avoid that shape.
I suppose that goes back to the point you were making to the convener earlier on. If the Chancellor just bit the bullet and done what hasn't been done for 40 years in terms of substantial tax reform, there's a much bigger question that needs resolved about the interaction of national insurance and income tax.
Exactly. I mean, I think you're right there that, Chancellors, for years have been kind of shying away from that. They, there's lower rates if you're a company owner manager than if you're self-employed, than if you're an employee. There's different treatments of, pension contributions if you're an employer versus an employee. There's a whole set of things that don't make sense, that have accreted over time, but that no Chancellor has been willing to kind of look at. But as I said, I think kind of it's a charge that can be kind of put at politicians in almost certainly every other country, but within the UK also, the devolved governments as well, where, we've not tackled, property taxation either. Well, in Wales they're doing something. In Scotland they're consulting on something, but ministers keep...
Not for the first time.
Ministers keep suggesting that they're doing that under something like duress, but...
Indeed. Before I start talking about the council tax, I'll hand back to you, convener.
Thank you, Ross. Appreciate that. And Michael, to be followed by Michelle.
Thanks, convener. Can we go back to the Scottish spending review, please, David? What do you think the Scottish Government need to achieve when they publish their spending review, and how do you think they should go about achieving it?
So I think kind of... if this weren't an election year coming up, what I would like to see is a full kind of, planned review, which is more than this sort of, if you like, salami-sliced approach. Because whether you liked or disliked the set of plans put out by Ms Reeves in the summer, there was a clear sense of services that were prioritised and services that were cut back in the UK government's spending review. I think kind of when we looked at the Scottish spending review in 2022, which was the last time there was a resource spending review, there was some differentiation across services there, but those services like health, which require substantial real increases, at that stage there was, if you like, the sort of fantasy that those budgets could be held more or less constant in real terms, so the cuts to other areas didn't have to be quite so big. The hope seemed to be that more funding from the UK government would come through and that would make that easier. At that stage, that more funding did come through. I think looking ahead, whilst I would expect there to be some, as I said, top-ups in 28, 29 onwards, because I can't see a UK government going into an election with, you know, such tight spending limits. I don't think the scale of increases the Scottish Government could expect will be anywhere as substantial as it received, you know, between 2022 and 2025. That's me saying that because I think that from the outset, I'd expect the Scottish Government to be quite ruthless in its prioritisation. And, you know, look, here's money for the NHS, here are the areas we're going to make cutbacks on, and here are the kind of programmes that we think have to go. If more money comes down the line, we'll reassess this, rather than, you know, if more money comes down the line, that's what we'll use to top up the NHS. I think you need to kind of like prioritise your key priorities at the start, and then if more money comes down the line, that's when you kind of go back to look at your secondary priorities. Now, that's what I expect in the absence of an election. With an election, I'm not sure whether it'll be credible for the Scottish Government to set out a series of plans that, you know, will span into the next Parliament and, you know, setting plans out for, you know, potentially 3 years into the next government, which could be a different government to them. In that case, what I'd want them to do is set out something a little bit more like, here is what we think is needed to achieve and meet the kind of pressures for these different areas, and here is some money that we've left over that we think could be used to achieve different sets of priorities. So I think kind of, you know, what I'd want as a bare minimum is a sort of a set of projections which show what we think is needed to be spent to maintain services, and then either a sort of baseline review which achieves that, or if they feel confident in setting out a kind of full political vision for the next Parliament in a spending review, a sort of spending review which sets out their political vision, but within, you know, with realistic allocations for different departments.
Okay. So they can't bind the next government in terms of spending priorities, but if they don't do this now, at the start of this spending review cycle, and we're already a fair way into it because it's been pushed back, you know, to be published in January, do we not miss the opportunity to try and set a trajectory around the overall picture? So you're talking about prioritisation within different areas, but there's the challenge that the Scottish Fiscal Commission have set out where we need to reach by 2930. So surely they have to address that issue in terms of the longer term trajectory, and they can't just kick that a further year down the road saying, well, you know, we'll wait and see what the next government is and they'll come up with some answers. It might be us, it might be somebody else.
So I think, you know, if you look at what the Welsh Government has done, the Welsh Government is doing a one-year budget, which is done, you know, initially it published what it called a neutral budget, which was basically inflation for everything, which we said was not neutral because many services need more than inflation to kind of be business as usual and neutral. It then used that as the basis of an agreement with one of the opposition parties currently. And, you know, in essence, I think it was trying to get some skin in the game from the opposition party to some of the difficult choices that are needed in the first year of the next Senedd term, so that they couldn't all just attack it as saying, well, this is your budget and it's, you know, bad because it cuts this and cuts that. At least one of the parties got to come in and have been involved in setting that budget in a meaningful way. Now, I don't know how that works in the context of spending. So with a budget, right, a budget has to be voted on by the members of the Parliament, and therefore, in the kind of, given the arithmetic, at least some opposition members will need to vote for it to be passed, or at least abstain for it to be passed. Spending review is just a spending review. It hasn't got that same political backing behind it. So I think one of the reasons why they didn't go down that route of, well, let's get Plaid Cymru on to kind of like support a 3-year spending review is they knew that, you know, they couldn't, because there was no vote, and Plaid Cymru could kind of still come back and say, no, this is your plan, we disagree with it. So come back to Scotland. Look, I think it's perfectly possible. They could say, look, this is a one-year budget. The politics are so uncertain that we don't feel we can kind of bind their hands, and it's actually worse to kind of give kind of departments this kind of like false sense of certainty when another government could come in and rip it all up. I think they could do that. Given where we are in politics in Scotland, I don't think I'm kind of like surprising anyone saying the most likely outcome is still it'll be an SNP-led government, so they'll probably, not certainly, but they'll probably be the party that's kind of like got a call in the shots post-election. I think in that world, it is more the case that they need to actually set out their stall in advance. What they shouldn't be doing is kind of like pretending that kind of, the next parliament is all sunshine and roses, and then just kind of shocking kind of people after the election with the tough choices that they need to make.
Okay.
But, I think they do need to leave a little bit of flex in there, because whilst it is good for departments to have more time to plan, that's only true if it's kind of a set of plans that are still going to be largely adhered to. If the plans might change substantially, it's actually, I think, worth to set them out in advance.
And as part of those longer-term plans, we've been told in the fiscal sustainability delivery plan from the Scottish Government that there would be a 0.5% annual reduction in the public sector workforce. I mean, do you think those figures are credible?
I mean, we've delivered cuts to public sector workforce on that sort of scale historically. I think during the kind of 2010s, we saw cuts in the public sector workforce greater than that at times, kind of at a UK level, when we saw cuts in the civil service and cuts to local authority staffing. But I think the kind of point you make there is that a 0.5% cut is not like 0.5% across the board, given that there are certain areas where you would be almost certainly needing to increase staffing, the NHS, which I think together makes up sort of about half of, or sort of just under half of Scottish government employees. If you're increasing that, you need to make bigger cuts elsewhere. The Scottish Government, to some extent, has tied its hands with teacher numbers. We're seeing big declines in kind of pupil numbers in parts of Scotland, and a pledge to maintain teacher numbers. Previously, it was to increase them. That is kind of tying kind of hands. No one wants to see teachers lose their jobs, of course, but when you've got a change in the demographic situation in an area, you do need to kind of reshape your workforce to kind of do things. So what I'm saying there is that within that 0.5% kind of overall reduction, in order to achieve it, we need to make cuts of 2, 3, 4% to some parts per year in order to kind of still resource those areas where numbers are going up or where you've made pledges not to cut numbers. So
if we're brought figures in a budget that says that the Scottish Government is going to achieve £200 million of a reduction in the public sector workforce in the following year, I mean, I suppose, is that a credible position? I'm just reference the figures that are published today. Public corporations headcount is up by 6%, 5.8%. 500. Other public bodies up by 0.7%. The devolved civil service headcount up by 1.5%. I mean, the trajectory is going in completely the opposite direction, despite the minister coming and telling us that they're getting this under control and it's heading in the opposite direction. It's just completely untrue.
So what I'd say there is, historically there have been periods where that has been possible, but it requires the political will to do it. And I think that's kind of the question. So I think kind of the question I would put to ministers, if I were you, was kind of, are you going to do this? Have you got kind of the political will to achieve this, given that it will be difficult? No one wants to see people lose their jobs, but if this is your plan, you need to follow it through, because otherwise your public finance plans won't add up.
Also, the last point I had was around AI. And the application you mentioned a little bit earlier on about how that might lead to productivity gains, or could potentially. We had evidence just last week from the Scottish Public Pensions Agency, who were talking about AI as a solution to some of their problems, but they've got a huge batch of records that aren't digitised. Does it not require a big leap in capital investment, potentially in big public services, to get us into a position where AI could be applied, rather than just seeing it as a kind of off-the-shelf box that could result in better outcomes and better productivity?
Yeah, so again, I'm not an expert on the kind of like technological solutions here and kind of the sort of size of investment you need for kind of future savings. I think there will be areas where there is a substantial investment required up front. And one thing I've said previously is that, you know, whilst everyone thinks about capital investment as like roads, railways, you know, kind of new buildings and so on, the kind of area where the UK government and the UK as a whole has traditionally invested less than other countries in terms of capital is not on infrastructure, it's on equipment and technology. So if I was thinking about kind of pivoting my capital budget, you know, whilst of course we'd like to have new roads, new railways and new technology, I might pivot it a bit more towards the new technology, because if you can kind of solve some of those productivity problems, that might then free up some resources, and further down the line you can do more on you know, roads and railways and so on. So I think there is a case to kind of like invest a bit more of the capital budget on technology, AI, and so on. Having, again, some of the kind of conversations I've had with council suggest some of the things they've done with AI have had pretty small upfront investments and pretty big returns quite quickly. So I think it depends on a sort of case-by-case basis. And there could be some things where, you know, you can kind of invest over a relatively short period of time and get large savings. But I think, you know, that won't be the case for every single thing. And I think the other thing I'd mention is that I think the kind of big challenge for the public sector when it comes to AI is not so much the back office type AI, where lots of businesses are innovating on that. And, you know, I think people have already accepted that, is what role does AI play in frontline service delivery, where it starts to come up against, you know, both the public's expectations about kind of, you know, person-delivered service, but also professional standards and the sort of professional standards, professional standing of teachers, doctors, medical practitioners and so on. You know, if there are ways in which you can apply AI appropriately in those frontline tasks, that could help, you know, doctors and teachers do more with the limited time they have. But it could also be an area where there's lots and lots of resistance from people that could feel that their traditional professional standard is under threat.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Michelle.
Good morning. Just a last few questions to finish off and take it up to the kind of big picture level. I mean, obviously we've seen pretty terrible growth figures, so how likely do you think it is that the UK could dip into recession? You know, we've had the kind of two figures. What's your predictions?
Yeah, so again, you know, I'm not going to make a prediction on sort of the economic forecast. What I'd point out is that the sort of OBR forecasts now, which are for growth of about 1.3 to 1.5% a year for the next 4 years, down from its previous forecast of about 1.7 to 1.9. So they've downgraded them a fair chunk because of that productivity downgrade to a large extent. Those are still a bit at the upper end of the forecasts, so they're a bit higher than the forecasts from the Bank of England and the IMF, but they're less of an outlier than they were before. You know, as always, you know, there's uncertainty, you know, with the economy. You know, is there a chance of a recession? Yes. Do I think that's a likely outcome? At this stage, I'd be happy to defer to the OBR and say, well, you know, this is all their central forecasts. Other forecasts think that it'll be slightly slower growth, but still growth. But maybe when the OBR is here, they might have actually done a sort of. You know, sometimes they do, you know, these fan diagrams that show the kind of probability of different outcomes. Perhaps within that, they've kind of done a sort of a projection of the chance of a recession that they might be able to kind of pass on.
And the other kind of area where, you know, jungle drums of carry on kind of saying it's at least a possibility is a sovereign debt crisis, which continues to, I think, remain a possibility, particularly when you look at debt to GDP ratios. Again, what's your latest reflections on that, the possibility of that?
So again, you know, we can't kind of rule out there being a sort of a panic about the sort of UK sustainability of our debt and sort of public finances. The market reaction to the budget was reasonably sanguine. It sort of took at face value that the Chancellor had, you know, put in place a kind of plan which in the short term did spend more and borrow more, but took at face value that she would then pare back spending, raise taxes, and then borrow a bit less in the longer term. That I was perhaps a little bit surprised they were quite so sanguine, given that that spending restraint and those tax rises come just before an election. I think probably the tax rises probably would go ahead, but I think the kind of chances that she holds down spending quite so much before an election is a lot less likely. But I think perhaps one of the reasons why the markets kind of felt a bit more relaxed than they might otherwise is clearly there's a sort of a chancellor there that has taken her fiscal rules seriously. To some extent, she's worked within the letter rather than the full spirit of them by borrowing more in the short term and only kind of cutting back borrowing later. But it's clear that she did respond in those later years with a sort of net tax rise. So I think whilst there's a chance of this, there's always a chance that if there's a shock, globally or a shock to the UK that the markets could panic. I think the reason they haven't so far, despite this, slightly questionable fiscal tightening penciled in for 2029, is that they feel it is a sort of chancellor that treats the fiscal rules, at least semi-seriously and yeah.
And there was a colleague of mine that pointed out that both the OBR and the Treasury have assumed that Whitehall departments will have zero underspend in 2028 to 2029, which is obviously just completely unrealistic. I think that was generally picked up on, wasn't it, across the board? And did you have any sense of, was that just yet more smoke and mirrors? Or?
So, traditionally the OBR, in its spending forecast, has always assumed that departments will underspend their budgets. Historically, UK departments have, on average, underspent their budgets. But given the range of pressures that are being faced on the NHS, on, I think it's asylum accommodation, I think SEND, special educational needs provision, the OBR is saying, well, actually, we now expect there not to be this underspend. We think actually they'll spend right up to the limit. Now, in the end, they may not spend up, or they may end up, bursting those limits to some extent. But I think what this is showing is that, already, 3 years out, those limits set for 28-29 look really, really tight. And as we approach the election, and as the sort of potential that the pain caused by trying to stick within those limits, which might mean the fairly tepid progress you've seen in the NHS starts to unwind, or in order to kind of find the money for special educational needs provision, which central government in England is going to take full responsibility for, cutting back some other areas of school budgets or other areas of public spending. As that starts to bite, that's why I think there will be upwards pressure on those budgets, and come the next spending review in 2027, when the fiscal forecast horizon, when that kind of point where your fiscal rules bind has helpfully moved forward a year or two, I think that's when the Chancellor will come back and say, oh, look, we're going to top these budgets up somewhat, which would mean more money, not just for UK departments, but for the Scottish Government and so on, but would just push up debt and push up deficit once again. It's just kind of almost like kicking down that reckoning down the road a little bit.
Right, OK. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one final question from me. We haven't really touched on capital, and the capital available to the Scottish Government will be in 29-30, much the same as it was in 23-24. There's 1.6% projected declines over the next 5 years. Now, given that the growth is the overall priority of the UK Chancellor, what are your concerns about that impact, given the higher level of inflation capital? But the second point I want you to respond to is the actual overall cost of public procurement in the UK compared to Europe, for example. It seems to me that comparisons with other countries in Europe are that the costs from consultants to actual construction seem to be incredibly more expensive for projects that are quite similar. I mean, from HS2 down south to the A9 in Scotland, the costs seem to be colossal. So I'm just wondering what the IFS view is on those two issues: capital, the capital position, and the cost of capital procurement in this country.
Yes. So the first thing to mention on capital is that overall capital budgets are set to rise, but a large share of that at the UK level is going into defence. So this is coming back to this kind of like guns versus kind of butter thing I mentioned earlier. When it comes to our resource, our day-to-day spending, the defence budget, our increases in defence spending aren't really eating much at all into our day-to-day spending. That's only sort of, the defence budget's day-to-day budget is only going up roughly in line with the average for the UK government. But for defence, it's going up by much more than average, which means that when looking at in England, the only two areas able to get an increase in capital budgets are, well, one, defence, which I guess is UK-wide, and then two, non-HS2 transport as the HS2 budget starts to come down. Now, what that then means for Scotland is because, the defence doesn't generate any Barnett consequentials, Scottish budget for defence is going up by less than the UK budget overall. And as you mentioned, it's basically sort of, it would have gone up and then it's going to come down slightly in real terms after that. What would that mean for growth? Well, I think it's important to kind of say in a sort of historical context, capital spending will still be relatively high. It'll be much higher than it was during most of the 2000s and most of the 2010s. But of course, the fact that it'll be less than it was in 2025-6 and 2026-7 by the end of the decade will mean that you can do less than you otherwise would be able to. But it is relatively sort of substantial budgets in that historical context. On that last point you asked about, I should probably not say too much. I have asked myself the kind of similar question that you've asked there. It does seem to me, just looking at sort of anecdotally, that the kind of costs for kind of major infrastructure schemes on transport are higher in the UK. I don't know enough about the actual detail and comparability of schemes, and then the factors underlying that, the extent to which it is procurement versus land versus regulation and so on. But I think that it's a really important issue to look at. I think the Infrastructure Commission, National Infrastructure Commission, has done some work on this, which might be worth looking into. And
the Faroe Islands has built tunnels cheaper than it's costing the UK to build roads on the ground per kilometre.
Yep.
So under the sea,
to the extent that's those comparisons are sort of valid, that is a big difference. But I think the National Infrastructure Commission, I think, has done some work at this. And that might be worth having a look at kind of the factors. But as you said, my own sort of looking at the anecdotes has suggested it's a big issue here because the latest one in London is the Lower Thames Crossing, which is like 11 miles in a 3-mile tunnel, and it's like £12 billion, which seems like a huge amount to me. But I'm not the expert on this, and I think the National Infrastructure Commission probably has got the best sort of expertise on that particular issue.
One considers there's suspicions of cartel and operation, etc. If this was the Economy Committee rather than a Finance Committee, I'm sure it was something we would look at had we the time to do so. But I want to thank you very much, actually, for your contribution today. We've gone over more than half an hour over time, and that's because of the interesting responses that you've given to our many questions. I also want to thank you, David, for coming all the way up here in person. It really does make a difference to scrutiny having someone in person rather than online. Everyone in the committee feels that, so it has made a difference. So thank you very much, and all the best for Christmas, New Year to you.
Oleg Llawen.
Yes. I would pronounce the Gaelic. I think it's Noleg Chridal, but I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Okay, well, thank you very much. And also, just before we wind up the public session, because I want to put it on record, I'm sad to be saying that Ross, this is his last attendance or meeting as a member of the Finance Committee. He has been a very valued member for the last 4.5 years of the committee. I appreciate that as the Green Party's co-leader in Scotland and also serving on 2 committees, he's got a very heavy burden, and so he has decided to sacrifice the best committee in the Parliament, his membership thereof, i.e. FPAC. But you will be missed, Ross, and all the best in the new year with your lighter load. Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to call a 5-minute break until we go into private session to allow our guests and broadcasting and official report to leave. Thank you.